In this video, we're going to try and show the gains from trade, but instead of using our PPF model, we're actually going to use a demand and supply model. Now, the model of demand and supply really shows us the relative price of a good, which at the end of the day is also opportunity cost. What we need to do with this model is we need to compare the domestic price of a good with the world price of a good. And by doing so, we can determine if a country has comparative advantage or not. If our domestic price is actually lower than what the world price is, and so I'll just keep that consistent. Right, so if our domestic price is lower than what the world price is, then we can say that we have comparative advantage because the country must be relatively more efficient at producing this good. So how do we show this using a demand and supply diagram? Well, first thing we need to do is we need to draw our demand curve, and we need to draw our supply curve. Now, hopefully you still remember a bit of this stuff from year 11. We have our domestic equilibrium, which is at obviously the point where supply and demand meet, where we have our domestic price, and we also have our domestic quantity. Now, if the market for gold, as is shown here, if that world price for gold is actually above the domestic price for gold, so we can illustrate that by having the world price above the equilibrium price, which means the world will actually value gold higher than what domestic consumers do. Australia has a comparative advantage in producing this good, and then we're going to export this good. Now, where are our exports in this model? Well, they'll be really where the surplus would be without trade. So if we have a look here at the point where the new price curve, the world price, intersects the supply curve, the demand curve, and also the supply curve, we can see that the area Q1, Q2, so Q1, Q2 is actually going to be equal to what our exports are. Now, there's going to be a change to consumer and producer surplus as a result, okay? Now, we know that because we are actually earning a higher price and we're supplying more, producers are going to gain, okay? Producers will gain, but then how can we show that using the concepts of producer and consumer surplus? First thing we need to do is we need to start lettering different areas of this diagram. Now, there's a very simple way that this is done, and we're going to keep this pretty consistent for all of year 12. What we're going to do is we're going to obviously go in alphabetical order, but we're also going to move horizontally as we do. So we're going to have area A up here. B will be next because there's nowhere else for B to go to next to the A. Then we'll go C, we'll go D down here, and E, just to illustrate our concept of consumer surplus. So originally, producers, so before trade, producer surplus, PS, equaled areas D and E. So it's the area above the domestic price below the domestic price and above the supply curve. So area D and E was producer surplus, and then before trade, consumer surplus was area A, B, and C. Now, because trade has occurred and exports have occurred, we need to show the gain that producers have received. So after trade, we can see that producer surplus has actually increased. Now we need to account for the area of exports, okay? So the exports are up here, because that needs to come into producer surplus as well. So because that has only just been added in, we're going to call this area F. And we can see that producer surplus actually now covers area B, C, F, one for you camper and fishers out there, D, and E. So producer surplus has gained, consumer surplus has shrunk to the area above the new price and below the demand curve, which is area A. So as a result, we can use the concepts of consumer and producer surplus to show the net increase in total welfare. Now, total welfare does increase. There's no deadweight loss in this diagram, and area F equals the increase in total surplus that is the result of trade.